the dense pine forests of northern Minnesota, October 1934, while the rest of America was still reeling from the Depression and the dust storms that had turned the Great Plains into a wasteland, a woman named Ingrid Larson stood at the edge of a crater in the earth and saw something no one else could see. The crater was fresh, carved just 3 days earlier when the largest white pine in the county had finally surrendered to age and rot and the weight of a late-season thunderstorm. The tree had stood for over 400 years, had been growing when Columbus first touched the shores of the New World, and now it lay stretched across the forest floor like a fallen giant, its root ball torn from the earth in a disk of soil and stone nearly 20 feet across. The hole it left behind was deep and raw, a wound in the forest floor that most people saw as destruction. Ingrid saw a home. She had 3 children with her that morning. Anna, 12 years old and already carrying herself with the serious determination of someone much older. Eric, 9, quiet and watchful, his father's blue eyes in a face that was all his mother's. And little Maya, just 5, clutching her mother's hand and staring at the fallen giant with a mixture of fear and wonder. They had been walking for 2 days, carrying everything they owned in bundles on their backs, sleeping in the open when darkness caught them, eating the last of the bread Ingrid had baked before they left. They had nowhere to go and no one waiting for them. They had nothing except each other and the desperate hope that somewhere in this wilderness, Ingrid would find a way to keep her children alive through the coming winter. Her husband Carl had left them 4 months earlier. He had not been a cruel man, not in the obvious way. He had simply been weak, hollowed out by years of failure and shame, unable to face another day of watching his family slide deeper into poverty. The farm had failed first, then the job at the sawmill, then the odd work that barely kept food on the table. When the bank took their house in June, Carl Larson had walked out the door one morning and never come back. He left no note, no explanation, no money. He simply vanished, as if the weight of his responsibilities had finally crushed him into nothing. The people of their town had not been kind. A woman alone with 3 children was a burden the community did not want to carry. The church offered prayers, but no shelter. The county offered the orphanage for the children and the poorhouse for Ingrid, an arrangement that would have separated her family forever. One neighbor, a widow herself, had let them stay in her barn for a few weeks, but even that charity had limits. By September, Ingrid knew that no one was coming to save them. If her children were going to survive, she would have to find another way. That way, she now realized, was staring at her from the bottom of a hole in the ground. If you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time. This story of a mother's impossible determination, of children who learned to thrive in a home carved from the earth itself, of a fallen tree that became a family's salvation, is unlike anything you have heard before. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from, and let me tell you about the woman who looked at destruction and saw a beginning. The fallen pine was a miracle of timing and location. It had come down on state land, technically open to anyone, far enough from the nearest town that no one would stumble across it by accident. The root ball, still held together by the massive tangle of roots, rose from the ground like a wall, 15 feet high and nearly as wide. Behind it, where the roots had torn free, was a hollow in the earth, roughly 10 feet deep and 12 feet across. The sides were a mixture of soil and clay, held together by a web of smaller roots that had not torn loose. The bottom was relatively flat, covered with loose dirt and stones. It was not a house. It was barely a hole. But Ingrid looked at it and saw walls, saw shelter, saw a place where the earth itself would protect her children from the winter that was coming. She set to work that very morning. The first task was to clear the loose debris from the bottom of the hole. Anna and Eric worked alongside their mother, hauling out rocks and roots and clumps of soil, while Maya gathered smaller stones into piles that might be useful later. They worked until their hands were raw and their backs ached, until the light began to fade and the temperature dropped toward freezing. That first night, they slept in the hole itself, huddled together under every blanket they had brought, using the root wall as a windbreak. It was cold and uncomfortable and frightening, but it was also, Ingrid realized, the first step towards something better. The next 2 weeks were a blur of labor. Ingrid had grown up on a farm in Sweden before emigrating as a young woman, had learned from her father how to work with earth and wood, how to build structures that could survive the brutal Scandinavian winters. She drew on that knowledge now, adapting techniques meant for different materials and different landscapes to the strange opportunity the fallen tree had given her. She began by squaring off the hole, cutting into the clay walls to create flat surfaces that could support a structure. The clay was dense and heavy, difficult to work, but it had one crucial advantage. It was stable. Unlike loose soil, it would not collapse or shift once it was shaped. She carved shelves into the walls for storage, carved a sleeping platform along one side, raised above the cold ground, carved a niche for a fireplace against the back wall, where the smoke could rise through the loose soil above. The root ball itself became the fourth wall of her home. The tangle of roots, still holding tons of soil, formed a natural barrier against the north wind. Ingrid wove branches between the larger roots to fill the gaps, then plastered the whole structure with a mixture of clay and dried grass that hardened into something almost like cement. The result was a wall that was not beautiful, but was remarkably effective, blocking wind and holding heat in ways that a wooden wall never could. The roof was the greatest challenge. The hole was open to the sky, and without cover, her family would be exposed to rain and snow that would make the space uninhabitable. Ingrid solved this problem by using the fallen tree itself. The massive trunk lay just a few feet from the edge of the hole, and she realized that if she could extend the shelter to meet it, the trunk could serve as the anchor for a roof. She and Anna spent 3 days felling smaller trees with a hand axe, trimming them into poles, dragging them back to the site. They laid the poles from the edge of the root wall to the fallen trunk, creating a sloped frame that would shed rain and snow. Over this frame, they layered pine branches thick enough to block the light, then covered the branches with strips of bark peeled from the dead trees that littered the forest floor. The final layer was soil, shoveled onto the roof until it was nearly a foot thick, heavy enough to hold the structure in place and insulating enough to trap heat inside. When they finished, the shelter was invisible from more than a few feet away. The roof blended into the forest floor, covered with the same duff and debris that surrounded it. The entrance was hidden behind a section of the root ball, accessible only if you knew exactly where to look. From the outside, there was nothing to see but a fallen tree and a slight depression in the ground. From the inside, there was a room nearly 12 feet square, with a clay floor and earthen walls, and a roof that kept out the weather. It was dark and it was primitive, but it was shelter. It was home. The people of the nearest town, a logging settlement called Iron Creek about 8 miles to the south, did not know that Ingrid and her children existed. They had passed through the town without stopping, avoiding contact with anyone who might ask questions or report them to the county authorities. Ingrid knew that a woman alone with 3 children, living in the wilderness without permission or support, would be seen as a danger to herself and her family. The children would be taken. She would be committed, or arrested, or simply driven away. The only safety lay in invisibility, in becoming so much a part of the forest that no one would know they were there. This invisibility was harder to maintain than Ingrid had hoped. Smoke from their fire rose through the loose soil of the roof, but on still days it was visible above the trees. The children's voices carried farther than she realized. Paths began to form between their shelter and the creek where they drew water, the meadow where they gathered plants, the snares where they caught rabbits and squirrels. Anyone paying attention would notice these signs of habitation. Anyone curious enough to follow them would find the hidden home. It was a trapper named Olaf Henriksen who found them first. In late November, when the first serious snow had fallen, he had been following a game trail when he noticed the smoke, had approached cautiously, expecting to find a poacher's camp, and instead found a woman emerging from what appeared to be solid ground, carrying a bucket toward a frozen creek. He watched from the trees for a long time, trying to understand what he was seeing. When Ingrid spotted him, she did not run or hide. She simply stood and waited, the bucket in her hand, her eyes meeting his without fear. Olaf was not a cruel man or a gossip. He was a solitary person himself, uncomfortable in towns, happiest when alone in the woods with his traps and his thoughts. He approached Ingrid slowly, introduced himself, and asked the only question that mattered. Did she need help? What Ingrid told him that afternoon, standing in the cold while her children peered out from the entrance to their underground home, would change Olaf Henriksen's life. She told him about Carl, about the lost house, about the choice between her family and the authorities who would tear it apart. She told him about the fallen tree and the hole beneath it, about the weeks of labor that had turned a wound in the earth into a shelter. She showed him the inside of their home, the clay walls and the earthen roof, the fireplace that vented through the soil, the sleeping platforms lined with pine boughs and rabbit furs. She showed him the food they had stored, the dried meat and the roots and the nuts gathered from the forest. She showed him everything, trusting him completely, because she had no other choice, and because something in his eyes told her he would understand. Olaf said nothing for a long time after the tour. Then he told Ingrid that he had a cabin about 3 miles to the east, that he had more food than he needed and no one to share it with. He said he would bring supplies when he could, would check on them through the winter, would tell no one what he had found. He asked for nothing in return. He simply nodded once, looked around the underground room one more time, and walked back into the forest. He kept his word. Every few weeks through that first winter, Olaf appeared at the edge of the clearing, carrying a pack filled with flour and salt, with dried beans and preserved vegetables, with things the forest could not provide. He taught Ingrid how to set snares that would catch rabbits even in deep snow. He showed her which trees had inner bark that could be eaten in emergencies, which frozen streams still held fish if you knew where to cut through the ice. He brought news from the outside world, told her about the weather predictions, warned her when particularly bad storms were coming. He never stayed long, never intruded on their solitude, but his visits meant the difference between survival and starvation. The children came to wait for him, to run to meet him when his familiar figure appeared through the trees. He brought them small gifts when he could, a carved wooden fox for Maya, a real steel knife for Eric, a book of plant illustrations for Anna that became one of her most treasured possessions. He was not family, but he was something close to it, a steady presence in their uncertain world. Ingrid tried to repay him with labor, with the rabbit skins she had saved, with anything she could offer. But Olaf refused it all. He said that the forest provided for those who respected it, and that he was simply passing along what he had been given. The winter of 1934 to 35 was brutal, even by Minnesota standards. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Snow piled up in drifts that buried the smaller trees entirely. The wind came down from Canada with a ferocity that could kill an exposed person in minutes. In towns throughout the region, people burned through their wood supplies and prayed for spring. The old and the sick died in numbers that would not be tallied until the thaw. In Iron Creek, 2 families lost children to pneumonia, and an elderly couple was found frozen in their cabin when their woodpile ran out 3 weeks before the end of winter. In their underground home, Ingrid and her children barely noticed. The earth itself was their insulation. Below the frost line, the temperature stayed remarkably constant, hovering around 50 degrees, regardless of what was happening above. The roof of soil and branches held heat from their small fire so efficiently that they rarely needed more than a few sticks to keep the space comfortable. The root ball blocked the north wind completely. The entrance, angled and covered with a heavy hide, let in no drafts. While the world above them froze, the Larson family lived in a cave of perpetual autumn, cool but never cold, protected by the same earth that everyone else saw as barren and hostile. The children adapted to the underground life in ways that surprised even Ingrid. Anna took charge of the cooking, learning to prepare meals with the limited ingredients they had, stretching their supplies with wild foods gathered before the snow came. She made soups from dried meat and roots, baked flatbread on hot stones by the fire, invented games to keep her younger siblings occupied during the long, dark days. Eric became the family's hunter, even at 9 years old, checking the snares each morning, learning to move through deep snow without exhausting himself, bringing back rabbits and squirrels that kept meat in their diet through the coldest months. Little Maya's job was simpler, but no less important. She kept the fire fed, watching the flames with serious concentration, adding sticks when they burned low, learning the rhythm of heat and fuel that would keep her family alive. The hardest part was not the cold, but the darkness. The underground room had no windows, and during the short winter days, the only light came from the fire and a single candle that Ingrid rationed carefully. They slept long hours, their bodies adjusting to a rhythm closer to the animals that hibernated around them. They told stories in the darkness, Ingrid sharing the tales her grandmother had told her in Sweden, Anna reading from the single book they had brought, a worn Bible that had belonged to Ingrid's mother. They sang songs, their voices echoing strangely off the earthen walls. They dreamed of spring and trusted it would come. They emerged in spring to a transformed landscape. The snow had crushed the brush and flattened the meadows, had torn branches from trees and reshaped the contours of the hills. But their home was intact, the roof still solid, the walls unchanged. The fallen tree that had seemed like destruction had become their salvation. The hole in the earth that anyone else would have seen as worthless had kept them alive through one of the worst winters in memory. Word of their survival spread slowly through the spring, carried by Olaf to the other trappers who worked the region, passed along in the casual gossip of men who spent most of their time alone. By summer, a handful of people knew that a woman and her children were living somewhere in the forest, in a shelter built into the ground, surviving without help from the town or the county or anyone else. Most dismissed the stories as exaggeration or fantasy. A few were curious enough to seek the truth. The first official visitor came in August, a county welfare officer named Harold Strand, who had heard the rumors and felt obligated to investigate. He was a tall man with tired eyes, a veteran of too many home visits where he had found children in conditions that haunted his sleep. He expected the worst. He always expected the worst, because the worst was usually what he found. He arrived at the site after a 4-hour hike through dense forest, following directions that a trapper had reluctantly provided. He expected to find neglect and squalor, children in danger, a situation that demanded intervention. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. The underground home had expanded over the summer. Ingrid had dug a second room, smaller than the first, for the children to sleep in. She had improved the entrance with a proper wooden door frame, built from logs she and Anna had felled and shaped themselves. She'd carved channels in the floor to direct any water away from the living spaces, had plastered the walls with a fresh layer of clay that made them smooth and almost warm to the touch. A chimney of stacked stones now rose through the roof, drawing smoke more efficiently than the original hole in the soil. The interior was clean and organized, with shelves of stored food lining one wall, with tools hanging from pegs carved into the clay, with beds made from pine boughs and blankets that looked warm and comfortable. There was a table built from split logs, smooth enough to eat from. There were chairs of a sort, stumps with backs woven from branches. There was a rag rug on the floor, bright with colors that Ingrid had somehow extracted from forest plants. The space smelled of pine and wood smoke, and something else, something Harold could not identify at first, but finally recognized as contentment. The children themselves were healthy and brown from the summer sun, well-fed and bright-eyed, clearly thriving in their strange home. Anna offered him tea made from forest herbs, served in cups carved from birch bark. Eric showed him the snares he had built, the fishing line he had woven from plant fibers, the bow and arrows he was learning to use. Little Maya sat in his lap and told him about the birds that nested in the fallen tree, about the fox that visited every evening, about the bear they had seen once from a distance. She showed no fear of the stranger, no signs of the anxiety and withdrawal that Harold had learned to recognize in children who were being harmed. Harold Strand had seen poverty. He had seen families living in conditions that broke his heart and haunted his dreams. He had seen children beaten and starved and neglected, had seen the empty eyes of people who had given up on life. This was not that. This was something else entirely, something he had no framework to understand. A woman with no resources had built a home from nothing, had kept her children safe through a winter that had killed dozens, had created a life in a place where no one thought life was possible. The children were not just surviving, they were flourishing. He stayed for 3 hours, longer than any official visit required. He asked questions about their food supply, their water source, their plans for the coming winter. He examined the structure of the home, testing the roof, checking the walls for signs of collapse. He found nothing wrong. He found, if he was honest with himself, something remarkably right. He left without filing a report. He told his supervisors that the rumors were unfounded, that there was no family living in the forest, that the whole thing was a story invented by bored trappers with nothing better to do. It was the only lie Harold Strand ever told in his professional career, and he never regretted it. The years that followed saw the Larson family become something between a secret and a legend. Those who knew of them kept the knowledge close, protecting the family from authorities who might not understand. Olaf continued his visits, bringing supplies and news from the outside world, watching the children grow. Other trappers began to stop by, drawn by curiosity and staying because of something they found there, a peace and a welcome that the harsh world outside did not offer. Ingrid expanded the home steadily, adding rooms as the children grew, improving the structure with each passing year. She dug a root cellar for storing vegetables, a separate chamber for smoking meat, a small stable where she kept 2 goats that Olaf brought her in the 3rd year. The root ball itself, still holding together after all this time, became the foundation of an above-ground addition, a proper cabin built against the earthen wall, half underground and half above, combining the insulation of the earth with the light and air of a conventional home. The children thrived in ways that surprised everyone who met them. Anna became expert in the forest plants, learning which were edible and which were medicine, developing a knowledge that she would later use to become a respected herbalist. She spent hours cataloging the plants around their home, pressing samples between pages of bark, learning from Olaf which ones the native peoples had used for healing. By the time she was 16, trappers and loggers from across the region sought her out when they were sick or injured, trusting her remedies more than the doctors in town, who charged money and often did less good. Eric learned to trap and hunt from Olaf, eventually taking over some of his trap lines when the old man's health began to fail. He had a gift for understanding animals, for predicting their movements and reading their signs that even Olaf said he had rarely seen. He could track a deer through dense brush, could call birds from the trees, could move through the forest so quietly that animals did not know he was there until he wanted them to. When he was 18, he began guiding hunting parties for wealthy men from the cities, earning enough money to help his mother improve the home and provide for the family. Little Maya, who had been 5 years old when they first arrived at the fallen tree, grew up knowing no other home and wanting no other life. She was the dreamer of the family, the one who found beauty in the smallest things, who could sit for hours watching the light change through the forest canopy or listening to the sounds of the underground home settling around her. She learned to read from the Bible and from newspapers that Olaf brought, developed a hunger for knowledge that the forest could not fully satisfy. But she never wanted to leave. The roots that had sheltered her as a child had grown into her heart, and she could not imagine living anywhere else. She was the one who eventually wrote down the family's story in a memoir published decades later that brought their experience to a wider audience. The book, titled simply The Roots, became a quiet success, read by thousands who found in it something they needed: proof that survival was possible, that homes could be built from nothing, that families could endure what seemed unsurvivable. Maya received letters from readers around the world, from people facing their own impossible situations, asking how her mother had found the strength to keep going. She answered every one, telling them what Ingrid had told her, that you do not find strength, you use the strength you already have, and that the first step is simply deciding that failure is not acceptable. The fallen tree continued to decay over the years, as all dead things must. But even in death, it gave gifts to the family it sheltered. The wood, as it softened, became home to grubs and beetles that attracted woodpeckers and other birds. The bark fell away in sheets that Ingrid used for roofing and insulation. The massive trunk itself settled lower into the ground, becoming more stable, more integrated into the structure of the home. By the 10th year, it was hard to tell where the tree ended and the house began. They had grown together, the dead giant and the living family, each one supporting the other. Carl Larson was never seen again. Rumors placed him in California, in Canada, in a dozen different places where men went to escape their failures. Ingrid never spoke of him to her children, never explained what had happened, never expressed either anger or forgiveness. He had made his choice, and she had made hers. The forest did not judge. The earth did not ask questions. The tree that had fallen gave shelter without demanding anything in return. That was enough. Ingrid lived in the home she had built for 37 years, until her death in 1971, at the age of 78. She was buried on the hillside above the fallen tree, in a grave that Eric dug himself, next to the garden where she had grown vegetables for decades. The children, long since grown with families of their own, returned to the forest for her funeral, and found they could not leave. Anna built a cabin nearby. Eric had never left at all. Even Maya, who had traveled the world and written books about places far from Minnesota, came back in the end to the roots that had sheltered her. The original underground home still exists, though it has been expanded and modified many times over the decades. The fallen tree has mostly decomposed now, reduced to a long mound of soft wood and moss, but the root ball remains, a wall of stone and soil that still shelters the north side of the structure. The earthen rooms Ingrid dug are still there, still cool in summer and warm in winter, still bearing the marks of her hands in the clay walls. Visitors come sometimes, friends and family and the occasional researcher, to see the place where a desperate woman turned a hole in the ground into a home. The lesson of Ingrid Larsson's life is not about survival techniques or wilderness skills, though she possessed both in abundance. It is about seeing possibility where others see only destruction. When that tree fell, it left behind a wound in the earth, a hole that anyone else would have stepped around or filled in or forgotten. Ingrid looked at that hole and saw walls that did not need to be built, saw insulation that nature had already provided, saw a foundation for a life that no one could take away from her. She did not overcome the obstacle. She transformed it. She did not fight against her circumstances. She dug into them and made them home. When someone leaves you with nothing, they have not taken your ability to see. When the world tears something down, it often leaves behind the raw materials for building something new. When you find yourself standing at the edge of a hole with nowhere else to go, remember that holes can be homes, that roots can be walls, that the earth itself will shelter those who have the courage to ask. What would you see if you stood at the edge of that crater? Destruction or opportunity? An ending or a beginning? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this story changed the way you think about shelter, about family, about what it means to build a life from nothing, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this every week, stories of people who found possibility in the most impossible places. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video. Because somewhere out there, right now, a tree is falling. And maybe, just maybe, it is making room for someone's home.